Welcome to Commander Central, episode 335, and today we're going to be talking about Precon decks and whether or not they should be bad. I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Kyle.
Kyle, welcome to the show. How's it going, bud?
It's going really well. I'm currently in a dungeon with Max here. It's wonderful, low lit. I like it.
I had to put pants on, everybody.
You don't go pantsless when guests are over. I respect that, Max.
Lawsuits just seem dangerous for us.
It's just not worth the headache.
They're legitimate pants too, not cargo shorts.
Nice. It's cool enough out. I was actually debating it this morning. Like, is it time to swap the shorts out for jeans? It's getting to be fall. One of these days, I'm going to have to actually do that. I don't like it.
No, neither do I.
Well, Kyle, welcome to the show. You are a local player and a patron supporter, and we've been threatening to have you on here at some point. And since Chris couldn't make this week's recording, we thought it would be what better time than right now.
Got to bring another red player in to replace the other one, so I guess it works.
Yeah. You don't probably play as much Modern as he does, but you do play a bit of Standard, don't you?
No, well, funny enough that a little bit of history on my game style or how I played. I actually started in Modern way back in Tarkir block, playing everybody's favorite deck, Tron, and then upgraded to everybody's second favorite, which was Infect, and then Lantern Control. So
I often hear stories about how much people enjoy playing against Lantern Control.
Yeah, all of the worst decks that everybody hates to play against, but they're wonderful puzzles for me. Played Modern up until probably Ixalan block, dropped off, and then came back during Ikoria. So I took a bit of a hiatus, but I've been playing Commander throughout all of that as well. So good long history.
Yeah, so you came back, because I think I first met you at our LGS right after people started, like it was about 1 year after the pandemic, so like basically last spring.
Yes.
And you had not been playing Commander very long at that point in time.
No, I had played during Tarkir block all the way up until Ixalan is when I had started playing Commander. Okay. The first Precon I ever bought was actually Duretti.
Back when the monocolor Planeswalker ones.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yep.
So why did you start, as someone who started off playing relatively competitive formats, what got you into Commander?
It kind of just spun out from a lot of, I have all of these extra cards from packs I've been cracking, and I want to use them.
Sure.
So how do I utilize all of these singleton cards I have? Well, my brother introduced me to this wonderful format called Commander, and I've been hooked on it ever since.
Which is kind of the path a lot of people go down, they start playing something and, after a couple of years of Standard and whatever else, their Modern deck changes. They've got a pile of cards there that are still good cards, but they're not necessarily Modern playable, and they're not, they've rotated out of Standard or whatever. And you basically have an EDH deck worth of stuff that's been sitting there from the previous formats you played. Mm-hmm. That's how a lot of people kind of get into Commander.
Exactly. And it was also just it was a different style of play. When you start playing those constructive formats like Tron, for example, it's very formulaic and there's definite lines and specific ways you have to go about it. But you also have 4 or 5, pseudo copies of everything in the deck. So they tend to be a lot more efficient. I just like the randomness and unpredictability of a singleton format that you don't necessarily get in a constructed format.
Yeah, and you're also not really brewing, like your Tron deck and your Lantern Control deck. I mean, some people might make individual tweaks based on, their meta or their personal playstyle, but for the most part, you're not sitting down and busting out the whiteboard or the murder board and putting together a list. And you're taking one that's kind of a pre-established archetype and maybe making some tweaks, or maybe not too.
Exactly.
And that's definitely something kind of new to Commander.
Yeah. I mean, the only time that ever really popped up was when we had the, what's the term I'm looking for?
Ban updates?
Not necessarily ban updates, but what we don't like to talk about, the fun little Eldrazi winter format of Modern. That was a wild, wild west of trying to figure out how to just simply survive in that format, which is why I started playing Lantern Control. It turns out playing Ensnaring Bridge does a really good job of stopping you from getting punched in the face.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you do see a little bit of it, I guess, if there's a team of Modern players, and we have locally at our LGS, there's a lot of guys that play Modern, and when a new set comes out, particularly a Modern Masters kind of set, they do a little bit of trying to figure out what the new thing is. So there's some of that, I guess. I shouldn't say there's no brewing at all there. Some of that does definitely happen, but it's not quite like it is in Commander.
No. But speaking of brewing,
yeah,
Precons.
So yeah, we're going to get into talking about that. This was suggested to us by listener Asher, and so the episode title could be called Commander Precons Should Be Bad. And he says, I don't mean to say that pre-constructed decks should be random piles of non-synergistic cards, but that it's a good thing that precons have imperfections. From personal experience, having a precon that was a little unfocused and needed tuning helped me grow as a player and a deck builder, and there are good and bad ways to create learning opportunities for new players, which might be an interesting conversation. He thought it would offer an idea for us to just talk about it as a podcast, and I think that does make sense, and it's actually a good one to bring in a guest to talk about here as well. So before we get into that, just briefly here, since we're starting out with a whole new Dominaria set, Kyle, did you do the Dominaria United pre-release at all?
I did not do the pre-release, but I did buy a case of precons because Squishy decided he was going to give me a deal, which, you know.
Oh, the pre-release kits?
Yep.
Did you happen to grab either of the Commander precons that came with it?
I did not get any of the precons this cycle. Neither one of them really jumped out at me as something that I necessarily wanted, or there wasn't anything in there that I wanted to, scavenge from those lists. Also, I'm kind of saving up for future precons. The Warhammer 40k precons, I'm looking forward to getting that whole set and just leaving those as they are.
Put them on the shelf and just stare longingly at them.
Well, bust them out with a bunch of friends is kind of the idea. But
yeah.
Just because I prefer playing, if I'm going to do that with precons, playing them in blocks, I think is more entertaining to me than trying to bust them out at the LGS.
Well, if you out there in listener land have bought some of these recent precons and have some thoughts about the show topic or just in Commander stuff in general, how'd you go about reaching us, Max?
You can find us on Twitter at CMDR Central. You can find us on Facebook by searching CMDR Central. Just Google CMDR Central and you will find us. Just don't go to page 8 of Google, please.
And thanks to all our Patreon supporters and all our listeners, even if the best you can do to support the show is clicking like and upvote. We appreciate that as well. So thanks to everyone out there for helping keep the lights on and keeping pants on Max. Should Commander precons be bad? So first of all, let's start with the notion that there should be a learning curve baked into these decks. Is that something you agree with, Kyle, and think makes sense?
I do. I think precons should have a nice, easy flow into them. A few good mechanics centralized around a specific commander and then a backup commander, obviously, to kind of get people eased into the format. To something that they can pull out of the box, hand to their friend, and go through it and say, hey, this is what this deck does, and actually have a game within a couple hours. Something that's going to give a good jumping board or springboard into maybe a higher level deck. I certainly think that's a good way to start with precons, for sure.
Max, what are your thoughts there to start with?
I think a precon having a learning curve is great, and that's kind of what I think they're for, is learning the format, or maybe you don't want to put together your own deck out of every extra card you've cracked in your packs. So here you go, spend the $40 and go buy a deck that's already put together and has some pretty clear lines to victory in most of these precons.
Yeah, I am on board with that too, particularly when you now have something like that Heads I Win, Tails You Lose precon that Gavin designed and put together. I think that really makes for a nice contrast point, because I do think there's room for that as well, once or twice a year or whatever. Like if WotC wants to put together a more expensive precon that's kind of been sculpted, particularly by somebody who knows how to brew, like in Gavin, there's basically not many people that are better than that than him. I do like that comparison. For someone who doesn't want to sit together and build a deck, you can buy something that some smart person has put together entirely. But I think the niche for that is probably much smaller than it is for a intro to Commander kind of deck, or at least a deck that is going to encourage you to make changes. And frankly, from a business standpoint, I get it from WotC's point of view too. They want you to buy the deck and then get other cards.
Yes.
And not just be done. So I also think there's a logic to it. Let's be real. They are a business. They have to make money. It'd be easy to say they should reprint all the dual lands and get them for $5 for everyone to buy, a tropical island. But the reality is there's business reasons they're not going to do that.
Right.
And you can not like those reasons, but they exist. Just there's no reason not to acknowledge the reality of the situation. The reality is I want to make money.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I think we're all in agreement that precons should at least have room for changes and room to be designed upwards and build a better deck for you. but I don't think they've hit the mark yet. I can think of very few commander decks, and I guess I will begin by acknowledging this is probably super difficult to do correctly and do at least the way that I think is correctly, but I don't think they've successfully done it very often.
Okay.
Now, do you guys agree with that or disagree? Do you think they've nailed, are you happy with what they're hitting, or do you think they can make changes?
I am happy with aspects of the decks that they're hitting. I think one of the biggest points or one of the biggest positives that Precons have going for them right now is their land bases are solid. You can hand that land base, regardless of what the deck's trying to do, you can probably take that land base out and substitute in any other deck that you want to build with it with just that land base, and it's pretty functional. Whether you're doing a Naya or a Gruul or a Grixis deck, the land bases have been very solid for a while now. Looking back, and you've played against this deck before, my Gavi deck, I don't think I had to change maybe 5 or 6 lands in that deck, but the deck itself runs just right for that deck in particular. And Gavi's a precon.
Right.
That I've been able to upgrade and strengthen, and at this point, it's not the deck I would hand to a newbie and say, here's Gavi, learn how to play it, but the land base is very solid for that type of deck. And it's come a long way, I think, in terms of where we started, especially the monocolored Planeswalker precons, where you had 41 lands in Peretti, and most of them were mountains. Like they've come a long, long way.
How about you, Max? What are your thoughts on that? Let's talk about the land base. We'll start with talking about that. What are your thoughts on how the land base looks in most of these precons lately?
I definitely agree with Kyle. The more recent precons have a much better land base, I think, because WotC has identified that they can reprint Prairie Stream into the ground, but it's a fetchable land for that new player to go buy that $5 Fabled Passage after their second time at the LGS playing that deck, to go do whatever they need to. The fact that some of them now include shock lands every now and then, that's pretty cool to see. I think there's been a lot of identifying that these dual lands are easy to reprint, but maybe not in every set. So let's put them in the sets that matter, which outside of Modern is Commander.
Yeah.
Your Legacy players have these, your Vintage players already have these, but your newer Commander players popping open a precon and there's a Stomping Ground or an Overgrown Tomb. That's awesome. There's a $10 card for them that they could put into a different deck down the road.
So first of all, I'm going to say that, again, this is not me defending Wizard of the Coast and defending anything they do to that feels like they're doing it particularly for money reasons. I'm not defending them. I'm just recognizing the reality of the situation. And the reality is they are not going to give away future sales from a fetch land by putting fetch lands in commander decks. That's just not going to happen. Should it? Maybe. Should there be fetch lands in, like, good fetch lands in 5-color decks precons are released? Maybe. They're not going to do that. That's too much future money for them to get you to buy the next set that has fetch lands in it that you are going to want for your deck. It's too useful for the secondary market. There's things they're not going to do. So let's just get that out of the way right away. You can like it or dislike it. That's fine. We're dealing with the whole cold hard reality of that. Occasionally you might get a shock land in the deck. I think they've done a much better job as we've gotten a lot more dual land cycles over the years, some of which just aren't going to maintain value. You mentioned that Prairie Stream, for example, Max. Those lands are pretty far down the list of what are considered a premier dual land. As a result, they're pretty cheap, so they're putting them in precons. I would imagine next year, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, you're going to see more and more of that as more and more of these dual lands become pushed down in value because they're just not good enough to make the cut in other formats. So they've been doing a much better job of that, and they will continue to do a much better job of that as more and more lands become available and are able to be put into sets. The value drops, whatever. Maybe we'll start getting, because pain lands are back in standard, maybe that will knock the price of pain lands down enough here in 2 or 3 years that we'll start seeing those showing back up in precons or something. So yes, they've been doing a much better job of that. I think they're going to continue to do a much better job of that. They've also, you mentioned 41 lands in that ready deck. They've also done a better job of that, of not flooding you with an unnecessary amount of lands in a mono red deck that doesn't care about particularly doing anything with lands.
Right.
They've gotten better about that. I do think they tend to err on the side of slightly too many lands in a deck. That's probably better than erring on too few. So if they put 38 in a mono red deck, that's probably slightly more than you need. But that, if you're gonna be slightly too many one direction or the other, I'd rather have them have slightly too many.
I mean, a couple of things here. You mentioned the pain lands, Dana. I'm looking at all the Battle for Baldur Gates Precon EDH decks, because that's the last time we got like 4 decks. None of them have a Pain Land in them.
Yeah.
So obviously they knew they were coming in Dominaria. Why reprint them?
Because there was a point in time we got a few of them when they were cheap.
I think they were in the Ikoria ones, to be honest.
Could have been. But
and Strixhaven.
They've since like drifted back up to the, over $10 for a lot of them. So they were not putting them in decks. And I get that. You can like it or dislike it, but like I know why they're doing it.
Yeah. Right.
I do think that they could do like, the original Odyssey filter lands.
There's the Sungrass Prairies and stuff like that.
That cycle was, nothing. They could have put a few more of those in decks over the years, I think. That's a cycle. They could very easily just print new ones and put in Commander decks. They don't get played anywhere but Commander. So, it's not like you're going to have a True Name Nemesis situation where some legacy player is chasing down those Precon decks just to buy the Odyssey filter for his legacy deck. That's not going to happen. They already know how they work. There's no play testing that has to happen either. They could just do that tomorrow. That would be the kind of thing I'd like to see them do more of, just to put like playable duels in Commander decks. I think the Odyssey filters are pretty good, and so they could do more of that. But like by and large, I think they've kind of figured out the land-based thing.
Which you kind of brought up a good point, and with the True Name Nemesis situation too, which I think is another aspect of Precons. We've seen here and there, some of them have been really good in that, but that's chase cards in those sets that are absolute bombs for players to have. We saw this with Dockside Extortionist, which just recently got a reprint.
Yep.
I feel that Commander's so tricky in that sense, where they'll have this pre-release or this release of Precons where sometimes some of these cards are really, really good, but end up being format warping in other senses. And I know generally we're not too worried about other formats, but there are chase cards that do become like monetary problems for players down the road.
Well, I think early on, before the modern master sets of the world existed, they were using Commander as a way to plant cards as solutions to problems for older formats.
Yep.
Like Flusterstorm was an example. That was absolutely not intended to be a Commander card. That was we want to get this card into Eternal formats because we need one more, way to stop Storm or something. So let's put it in a Commander deck, and that way we can get it into Vintage and Legacy without having to put it into Standard or something. Trinity Nemesis was the same way. It's like that was a thing I think they used to do. It also gave them a way to hedge their bets in terms of selling Commander decks. Okay, we want to sell these decks to Commander players, but we don't know how good that market is, so let's also throw this Flusterstorm in there so, our competitor players might pick up the decks too, and that way we have 2 different groups of people that are hopefully going to be buying these decks. I think at this point, they've also discovered that not only is there other venues for printing those cards into Eternal formats, and they also don't care anymore about Vintage and Legacy, but they've obviously established that Commander can hold its own in terms of sales, if not be the driving force for sales. So they seem to have moved away from that, which I think is for the best. I remember trying to find those decks back in the day, and that was a pain in the butt when some, Legacy players trying to chase down the same deck as you are because they want that True Name.
Right.
Yeah, so back to the lands here, I think that was a bit of an aside, but the one complaint I have is I do think they still sometimes put too many lands that maybe teach new players bad habits. I think there's a lot of arguments about Temple of the False God. I don't think it's unplayable in Commander. I think there are some people that have stronger opinions on it than me, but I think it's a really dangerous card to give the new players.
Yeah. It's definitely a trap card, especially if you see it in your opening hand, you're just starting and saying, oh, this taps for 2 mana, but they fail to realize or read that subclause of it. You have to have X amount of lands in play in order for that effect to even begin to work.
If Max tells me that Temple of the False God is great in one of his decks, I will believe him, and I will assume that he knows how to play around it. I don't think that, your new player, I think it causes more problems than it does good in those kind of decks for sure. I think the cycling lands, particularly like the monocolor cycling lands, showing up in monocolor decks, like your mono red deck is not drawing so many cards that you're going to frequently want to be pitching that cycling land just to get a draw. Don't get me wrong, there's some decks that care about cycling specifically. I'm not talking about those, but they had a tendency to put those secluded step kind of cycling lands just in every deck once upon a time.
Yeah, like, it's the most powerful card in Magic, Dana. Secluded Steep is the most powerful card in Magic.
I guess, yeah. That's a throwback to a lot of years ago.
Episode 20.
But that's I think those are cards they need to be a little more cautious about putting in decks, because I do see a lot of new players running way too many of those kind of ETB tapped lands that don't need to come into play. You just don't need that. You're better off. If it's a 2-color deck and you're playing Boros, you don't have enough card draw that you're going to have extra lands on hand anyway. All you're doing is making yourself play a bunch of lands that come into play tapped. So I think they can do some tweaking there, but I also tend to agree they've more or less figured that out.
Dana, I only run Temple of the False God in one deck.
I
literally just looked at all my deck lists.
I think I have it in at least one deck as well, that draws a ton of cards and has land. It's and has plenty of land drops. So like that's the weird thing about Temple of the False God. It's best in decks that don't need it. When you're playing green, it's much easier to hit your land drops. So it's so much easier to turn it on, and you're also the color that ramps best, so you need it the least. And
it's also too colorless too.
Yeah,
like
in the decks that need it the most are the ones that can reliably have it make 2 mana the most infrequently. So
I run it in Brago.
Yeah, where you draw plenty of cards and you have plenty of options. Yes,
and I can untap it with a bunch of ETB effects.
Yeah, no, I like there are Benny Smith always harps on what a terrible card it is, and I love Benny, but I don't entirely agree with him. I do think there's plenty of places it's good. I don't love the idea of new players cracking it and having to like figure that out. Like you said, Kyle, they might not have the game experience to not keep it in that opening hand. Like, I've got 3 lands. Yeah, but one of them doesn't work. Yeah, so you have 2 lands and 6 cards basically.
Yeah, I will say though, I do have a certain, and this maybe stems from having a Gavi deck, but I do personally like the cycling effect on those cards, just as a beginner player, because you might not know, okay, what is good card draw in this game? Or when you're building this precon for the first time, cycling is such a weird effect because it's an activated ability of the card while it's in your hand, so it doesn't, it's not a cast, it's not, the only way to stop it's really a stifle effect.
Right.
So there's nuance there that newer players might not pick up on, so I can understand that trap. But I've never felt bad about late game, getting a cycling land and being like, well, I actually don't have a need for this land. I can pitch it. So there's corner cases for it, I feel, with certain types. But I do see how that can be a trap for newer players.
A newer player, yeah.
Especially in the opening hand, playing the cycling land on turn 1 and then everyone else pops off with the Soul Ring because that happens all the time.
Right, yes. So let's move on a little bit here from the land base. Are there any other things? So here, I guess I will start this off and just throwing it to you guys. When I think of the kind of template for what I want to see them do with a Commander Precon, I think of the 3-color Bant Enchantress deck we got that Max's Tuvasa Commander was in.
Yep.
So you have Tuvasa, Estrid, and what was the other commander in the deck?
Castia, I think.
Yeah. So what I loved about that Commander Precon that I think they've, and again, I'm going to acknowledge this is difficult to do, but that deck, every single card in that deck supported all 3 of those commanders.
Yes.
Not perfectly, and you're never going to do that, nor do you probably want to have a deck so generic that it works perfectly with all 3 commanders. But I think what you don't want is a deck where all 3 of the commanders actively fight one another, and you're running some cards that are good for one and useless for another, and I think they've done that plenty too. That same year, I want to say the Gyrus deck was all over the place.
Yeah.
Was that the Windgrace deck?
That was Windgrace, Gyrus. Windgrace was the face, Gyrus was a backup, and the Spider was the backup, the Thantos or whatever it is.
Kind of like a proto-goad kind of commander?
Or that, yeah, it was if you attack me, I draw a card, and everyone has to attack every turn, I think.
So you had a commander that was
in front of me. I could just
so you had kind of a goad commander, you had kind of a landfall commander, and one that kind of played out of the graveyard and cared about Hydras. None of those overlap one another really very much.
No.
And so you had those 3 decks there was pieces in it that were useless with other commanders compared to the Bant deck where it just felt like you could run whatever one of those 3 commanders you wanted and have the deck be really, really playable and not feel like you were drawing dead cards at all. I like that a lot. I like when they and again, difficult to do, but like that I think is what you ideally want. You want that deck for a new player to have them pull it out and go, oh, this card works with it. These all work together. I get it. I'm going to run this commander that I like the most and have all the things work, versus not only have it feel bad when you crack that Lord Windgrace deck and realize a bunch of this stuff doesn't work with Lord Windgrace or doesn't work with Gyrus or whatever, but then you, I think, then set it in the mind of new players like, oh, I'm playing this Windgrace. Well, these cards must be good for this deck because they were in the Precon. Well, yeah, they were in the Precon for Gyrus, not for Windgrace.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things they need to be conscious of that they don't always hit the mark on. But I think, again, over the years, they've gotten better and better on that.
Yeah, I believe like in, every set there usually is at least one or two of the precons that really do emphasize that and do really well with that.
Mm-hmm.
You look at Kamigawa, the Kotori Shurikai deck is an amazing precon, and the best commander of it's Shurikai, and that's the secret commander. And then you look back even further, at some of the other sets you have up there, and there usually seems to be at least one or two that follow that line where there's just wonderful synergy throughout, and I think that's a really good way to go. But different synergies where each one can kind of go in its own way.
So let's talk about, I guess, the Bant decks we're just talking about. It makes a good jumping off point too. There were a lot of good cards in that deck, things that enabled what that deck wanted to do, but it was still pretty open-ended too. You can get that deck and switch it over to Tuvasa. Let's say you liked the way Tuvasa played like Max did.
Yep.
You have a land base that's pretty decent. You have some cards in that deck like, Eidolon Blossoms, like, oh, it's an enchantress. It's going to draw me a card when I play enchantments. This deck's got a bunch of enchantments in it. I get that synergy. That makes sense. Okay, what else does that? Well, there's no Argothian enchantress in here. It's also kind of an expensive card. At the time, it wasn't. It was, $10-ish. It's like 40 today, I want to say. But at the time, you're like, oh, Argothian Enchantress. That'll be useful for this deck. It's, $12 or something. No, I'm going to go buy that at my LGS this week when I'm there for Commander Night and add that to my deck. Like, there was cards in the deck that you wanted to keep in that deck, and then it gives you, as a new player, things to shoot for over the course of the next year. Tweaks and changes you can make to that deck that are good for WotC, presumably, because it keeps you interested and keeps you like chasing down new cards, and also good for your LGS, good for everybody. I do think there's, again, a logic to them not giving you a perfect precon, and I think that keeps player interest. I think that's good for people to constantly to look at that deck and like have things out there to keep them kind of chasing that light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, I will agree that the precons lately have also been really good about seeding that interest for future products too. Because as we had mentioned with the land bases, they didn't have a single one of the pain lands in a previous set, and then lo and behold, in Dominaria United, we have them. So now they're getting a lot better about forward thinking in terms of their products, which I think is really good.
Yeah, you're somebody who bought one of the precons this spring, and you've loved your deck, you've been playing with it, and now all of a sudden you're like, oh, I just cracked a pain land in my pre-release kit for Dom United that's going straight into my commander deck.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're not a standard player or whatever. Like that it gives people something to chase. And particularly early on for me, that was a big deal. I remember that. I remember building my Glissa the Trader deck and putting a demonic or a diabolic tutor in it and being like, I'm at some point going to upgrade to that $10 demonic tutor sitting in the card case at the LGS in 2015.
$10. Oof.
Will I buy it next week? I'm like, I'll buy it the week after. And like, okay, the following week, I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna buy that demonic tutor this week. And like, okay, so that strip mine's only $6. Okay, next week I'll get that strip mine for it. And obviously prices for some of those cards today are not what they once were.
Right.
But ignoring the demonic tutor, there's still plenty of those cards where you're like, next week that $10 card I'm going to buy for my deck. And I complain all you want about capitalism, but like I understand the logic of that. And I do think it's a good way to keep you interested in the game and interested in the deck. And that's probably in the grand scheme of things kind of good for a commander.
Oh yeah. It's called cardboard crack for a reason, right?
Absolutely. For sure. So what else? Max, is there anything that you think the last couple of years, especially that's jumped out at you as like they've really kind of gotten better and figured this thing out?
I do think over the past few years they've gotten better at making more of the decks all equally desirable, I guess, except for the few that have a chase card. I still think they haven't done it perfectly. There is always that one deck that nobody wants. It's the one you see on your Walmart shelf that's been there for a year. It's the one your LGS is like $5. If you buy a pack of Double Masters 2, I'll sell you the deck for $5. Like, they just want it gone.
I feel, yes, they've gotten better about it. They're definitely not as bad as it was like that year with the 2-color decks for that Kalemny Anya deck.
Right.
It was awful.
Oh, yeah.
The experience counter one.
Yeah, just awful.
Overall, though, what I think they're doing right is bringing out more precons. Like, when we first started playing, it was the yearly precon in November. And now it moved to the spring right before the pandemic. And now we're getting them with every standard set. You get 2 decks, maybe 4. We're getting these Universes Beyond decks with Warhammer coming out here this fall. I think it's just more product availability. So, hey, the Adventures from Forgotten Realms decks didn't do something for me, but the Kamigawa one did. And it's giving more players more choice based on And theming them around these standard sets makes it more enjoyable because for someone like you, Dana, you love Dominaria lore.
Yeah.
You'll probably go buy these precons or the cards of the characters.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Where I'm not a big lore fan for Dominaria, but when we go back to Ravnica, I'm probably going to grab those in a heartbeat.
Sure. So again, they're going to release a product. It used to be those legend decks. So that's where Talrand came from originally. That's where Odric came from, and that's where Krenko came from. They would release these decks that had a legend, and it was just a 60 card deck with a legend on the front. I'm not sure why they had a legend that was a face card, but that's what they did. Eventually, they switched to these Planeswalker decks that had these bad Planeswalkers, that's 7 mana, a Johnny, or whatever it wound up being, with every set as well, to kind of like fanfare in whatever the standard set was that you were in that particular plane. They have replaced those now with these Planeswalker decks. But those legend decks were always pretty terrible, aside from maybe you'd get a good legend that was in the decks. Odric was good, Talrand, Krenko, whatever. Same thing with those Planeswalker decks. Like maybe, okay, I'm playing I have a Chandra tribal deck, so I'm going to put 8 mana Chandra in there that has, an ult that does 5 damage to all players, or something that's also equally terrible, because they didn't want that to mess up standard. I mean, maybe a couple people wanted that Chandra, but like those were by and large not that popular with most people. Those were like someone's mom was in Kmart and, oh, my son plays Magic, I'm going to grab this for him. Like that's what I bet majority of the sales for all of those were. They've now swapped those to Commander decks, and you can ignore them if you want to, or it gives you a product that's actually useful if you want to play Commander. Like, I think that's, I get why they made that change. And yes, it's maybe exhausting to have a ton of decks released every year, but like, that doesn't mean it's not a good idea. Right. Having that option is better than not having the option, I would say, even if you choose to take advantage of it.
Another thing I think that doesn't get talked about a lot, though, with some of these precons is oftentimes you'll also find a lot of cards in these decks that are trap cards that aren't necessarily really good or synergistic, that don't do a whole lot to forward the game plan, but perhaps in that like commander precon block, they're effective at dealing with another one of those commanders. Because whether, we realize or not, a lot of people still play kitchen table and don't actually go to an LGS. So I think one thing that they do really well that helps for that transition between kitchen table to LGS is they have these trap cards that are essentially easy flex spots for players to identify. I'm trying to find one here. I believe it was in the Strixhaven black and white commander. There was I think it was a Griffin or something. All I know is a horrible card, and it was the easiest card for me to pull out of the list because it didn't do what you wanted it to do. But I think that's an important aspect that precons should have.
Sure. Well, so
like the intentional bad card, like that's awful. Why would I have that?
Or not even bad necessarily, but like just one that is clearly designed for new players playing against other people with a precon. So Zendikar Resurgent, I think, is a good example of that, or Sandstorm Convergence is one, both of which are enchantments in green that cost, 7 or 8 mana or something, that have kind of a big, powerful, splashy effect. But the reality is, if you are playing at your LGS with people who have brewed their own decks, the risk versus reward for those is probably not worth running either of them. Yeah. You'll take those out. But if you're a new player and you are playing against one of your friends who just bought a precon as well, and you stick that Sandworm Convergence and start making, worm tokens, or stick that Zendikar Resurgent and you have a Wilderness Reclamation stapled to a mana reflection, that's crazy good.
Yep.
and feels great for a new player. Like there's everyone makes a joke about how Zakama gets printed in every single white commander deck. That's the dragon from Ixalan that has 6 keywords.
Yeah, it's an Elder Dinosaur, the Pterodactyl.
Or Dinosaur, sorry, yeah.
Yep. Has keyword soup on it.
Yeah, indestructible, double strike, flying, lifelink, maybe? Whatever.
And Vigilance, I want to say.
Yeah, it's absurd. And it's not necessarily a great commander card, but if you're a brand new player and you open that deck up and you're like, it's got a mythic symbol on it and it's a giant flying Elder Dinosaur with 6 keywords...
Yep.
That feels great if you're a new player who's just like looking for big flashy things, or like you're 14 years old and you're a kid and you're just like, I just, want to smash dinosaurs into one another. Like there's a reason they put those kind of cards in precons, because they're like really eye-catching and exciting for a new player who's playing at that power level to drop onto the board.
Yeah. The card from the Strixhaven deck I was thinking of was Hunted Lamassu, the 4-costed 5/5 flying. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent creates a 4/4 black horror creature token. Like that, for me, that's always going to be like the card that instantly gets pulled, because why would I want to give my opponents something to start beating me in the face with without any sort of benefit? Yeah, it's a undercosted flying 5/5, but I'm also giving them something to start beating me with too. So it's
those cards are easy colors, is it?
What's that?
It's not even in Zedru, the Great-Hearted colors, so you could
give it away.
Yeah.
Well, actually the creature is a white creature, so
it's white. Okay,
yeah, so it does work, but I mean, Zedru's got its own thing going on.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. Yes. So there's also a few, but again, if you were playing in a precon against other precons, the odds are that creature's going to hit somebody else that isn't you.
Yep.
So there's a reason that's in there too. That's probably a fun card to play if you're playing on a precon against other precons. The power level, and it also gives you an easy cut to pull out. Yeah, that's the other end of it too. You want to have, not only do you want to give people obvious upgrade paths, you want to have them look at that band deck and say, I can put an Argolian Enchantress in here, and that would be really good. And maybe I can save up down the road and get I don't know, I can't remember if Enchantress's Presence was in there. I bet it wasn't, because I bet it was expensive at the time. Because that Sense got a reprint, but it hadn't had one. So I got get an Enchantress's Presence for that deck. And, Ancestral Mask and whatever. Like, there's a handful of cards you can look up and find for your deck, but you also want to have you want to have the new player look and be like, what am I going to remove? Well, Hunted Lamassu or whatever it is.
Land.
Or land, right.
There's 39 in the deck. You can cut one.
You want to have them look at their deck and realize that there's things they can pull out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like this list is not set in stone.
Right.
And because it's also going to depend too on what you're playing against more often. Like if you need some answers for what people are playing in your LGS, like it's easy to cut that Hunted Lamassu for a Swords to Plowshares, right? I don't remember if that's even in the deck list, but you get the point.
I don't think in Swords usually isn't. It might have been in some in the past, but I don't think Swords very often has been in those. But again, and that's an easy one. We've been talking, yes, about pricier cards, but there's also a logic to have it not even be something that you have to save up for and chase down. Like, hey, this deck is white and Swords to Plowshares is the best removal spell ever printed. I'm going to go grab a Swords to Plowshares from my collection that I have sitting there. That's a 25-cent card, but it's still, yes, they could include that in every white deck for the price. They could do that, but by not including it, it's giving people a reason to upgrade that deck.
Very true.
So I'm just going to stop and just say the internet's going to yell at us. Swords is in a lot of Commander decks. Path usually isn't.
I just brought it up too, and I'm looking at it right now. I think that's been a recent thing though. If you look, Max, a lot of those are the last year or two. Yeah. There was a window there where it looks like they weren't putting it in a bunch of Commander decks particularly early on.
It looks like pretty much post Commander Legends 1 where we started seeing it a lot.
I agree. Yeah,
it definitely was not in the Silver Quill statement Precon though.
And those early ones, it wasn't either. We had a run there where really the only printing was in Conspiracy. So it was not showing up in Commander decks for a while
those random yearly auxiliary products, whatever they call them.
And then it started showing up in Commander decks post Magic 25, it looks like.
Yep.
And it was also probably a $2 or $3 card maybe before then, and now the price has gotten low enough that it's not even something worth worrying about too much. But yeah, Path is not at all. So Path now, and Path has dropped in price enough that it's not super expensive, but it also gives you something to add and to think about, do I want to add this? Yeah, of course I do. Path of Exile. It's the second best creature removal spell ever printed. So yep, there's a total logic to that for sure. Anything in particular you guys like to see them work on more or work to tweak or work to change in these precons?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to try to answer the overarching question here. I don't think precons should be bad. I think where they have headed in the last few years is I think they want precons to do two things. One, you should be able to play them within the group of precons from that set, and that's been pretty well done for a while now. But I think more recently, and I think the first one that really pops in my head is the Party Time precon deck.
Well, it's really good.
It's really good. I think they're trying to figure out how to put more than just one really good deck. Where you can buy Party Time and go sit down in a pod at your LGS against more optimized decks. Now I'm not talking like your Reki deck, Dana, or my Brago deck, but Party Time as is has kicked the crap out of Jamoka. It has kicked the crap out of Ubash. I think they need to be good enough to do that, where you can sit down, have a decent Rule Zero conversation, and that precon's going to hold up. And, and the caveat to that is it still needs to be upgradable. You can take party time and find a new cleric and find a new something else. That's probably better than that random card in the deck. But as it is out of the box, that deck is ready to rock and roll, and I think they all should be moving forward.
So we probably should have, I think we were using the term bad kind of hyperbolically. I don't think they should be bad either. And are a lot of precons bad, quote unquote, compared to someone's tuned 2-lane list or their CEDH deck or something? Sure. And are they maybe bad in terms of there's a ton of changes you could make? Yes, I guess. But I don't think they should be bad literally in the sense that they're bad decks at all. I think what we think is they shouldn't be for the most part, that heads you win, tails I lose deck where it's done. So I think that rather than bad, we should say Commander Precon shouldn't be finished.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely.
Does that make sense, I think?
Yeah, context is definitely very key with that. A precon slapped down a table should obviously do better than, 99 cards somebody slapped together and tossed on the table, but it shouldn't be obviously worse than that. It shouldn't be to quote Grandma's Boy, Mike Tyson fighting an infant.
Right, right. Yeah, a deck can be effective while not being finished. So no, that's a good thing to do, Max, is to kind of clarify what we mean by that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, to the previous question, is there anything you'd like to see them work on a little bit more because we think we all agree they've done a much better job and they've got them to a point that we're all pretty happy, but are there anything in particular you'd like to see them work a little bit more on with these decks?
I like to see them kind of start going back into their library of mechanics and start bringing some of the old ones forward a little bit more. For example, there's some weird mechanics out there, like horsemanship. When was the last time you saw something that really cared about horsemanship? And I use that as an example, but there's other mechanics that they haven't touched that maybe necessarily they let go to the wayside or something, or they don't have enough support that maybe should get brought back and done a little bit more. I'd like to see a little bit more stark contrast and less just nuance between the decks.
Banding. Kyle wants banding. That's all he wants.
Bring back banding.
I would love to get a couple of cups and explain banding to people. It's one of my favorite discussion topics.
Yeah, and I do think we've seen some of that in the past where they're okay, this is a morph deck. We're going to bring back morph for this. We're going to make a deck that revolves around cycling. But yeah, they could absolutely dig a little bit deeper. They could also just randomly throw one-off keywords in there.
Teferi's Protection did that.
Perfect. That's where I was going, Max.
Yeah.
Now, we've gotten phasing since then, but at the time, we hadn't seen phasing in a decade. And all of a sudden, there's just a random card that has phasing. Mm-hmm. But didn't seem to cause any problems. Not only did it have phasing, which we hadn't seen in a decade, they changed how phasing works.
Yeah.
Because prior to that, tokens that phased out were gone, and they specifically changed that for that card.
Yep.
They were.
Yeah, one of my favorite things ever is I loved how Time Spiral Block was just all of a sudden this card has, hey, we haven't seen keywords in a while, and now this creature has Rampage and ban with other Kavu.
Yep.
Or whatever. I mean,
ooh, Kavu.
But I liked how they would just throw these random things out there, and there's no reason in Commander decks we couldn't see a little more of that for sure.
Exactly.
Rampage. I want Rampage back.
And that, I think that's also interesting for new players when they're what is this keyword? That was a thing that was once printed back in Weatherlight. Mm-hmm. And it makes people look up game stuff and chase things down, and it makes you curious to delve into the game's past a little bit. Yeah,
or bringing back, weird tribes that we haven't seen in a long time. Yep. When was the last time they printed an Atog?
Right, yeah.
I would love to see them go back to some of that and just give a little bit more of that, the lore aspect, the Vorthos aspect that you and I love, Dana.
Sure.
And bringing some of that more to the forefront. Because there's additions that we haven't touched or looked at in a long time that might not necessarily require us to go back there for a standard block, but for a commander product, that would be great to see.
And I guess this was more of me saying I hope they continue to do what they've already been doing a good job of, because I do think they've been doing a pretty good job of that, and I want to have them see them continue to do that. Similarly, tapping into lore characters. For a while there, when they were making these commander precons, they were just hey, it's Jim Bob of Clan Cadillac. Whatever. It was a brand new character.
Enemies of the Fords.
Right. And they've been doing a much better, and he's a vehicle commander. They've been doing a much better job the last few years of being we never did print a, I'm trying to think of what. There's so many lore characters that we've gotten in the last few years that I can't choose one. There's a Gerard card, because we didn't have a good Gerard card before. So here's our attempt to give you a good Gerard card. That kind of thing. They've been tapping into old lore characters. Finally got a Lord Windgray's card. Finally got a whatever. they've been doing a good job with that, and I'm glad to see them continue to go down that road as well, to like, rather than just make up a whole new character, like we never have done this one character from the past, so let's dig them up and give you a card for them for the first time.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to see them do that. I hope they continue to go down that road. I think there's if you don't care about lore, it changes nothing. There's no downside to it. And if you are someone who like has played the game a long time and does know that kind of stuff, I think it's good for those kind of people.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I do think the one other complaint I would have had if we would have done the show 2 years ago is I do think that they were delving a little bit too much into the do a thing, draw a card.
Yeah.
We had to run that year, one particular year where we had the Madness Commander who was do a thing, draw a card, and we had the Morph Commander who was do a thing and draw a card. So they were stapling, they were, I think, making a lot of those commanders a little bit too powerful, and they were making them powerful in ways where it encouraged you to not play them correctly. Like the Madness Commander, Anji Falconwrath, was supposed to be a Madness Commander, but like the whole point of the deck wound up being just discarding stuff down until you hit a combo piece.
Yeah.
Like it was a Madness Commander in kind of theory only. It was just a combo commander. And there's a ton of combo commanders. Like I think they've since then figured out ways to make their specific keyword or theme or idea commanders powerful without just giving them a bunch of things on the body. So I think I would have had a complaint about that a few years ago, but I think they've gotten much better about that.
I'd like to see some commanders come in with a bit more interaction on the board state too immediately, or things that you can do multiple times, maybe to plays like control aspect. One aspect I don't see a lot of in EDH in general right now is stifle effects. I rarely see somebody drop a stifle or nimble obstructionist, and I think that would be an interesting avenue for them to employ, because you see a lot of times, especially in our game that we had this week, your fling deck. Had I had a stifle effect, that would have been a very different situation. And I think that's something that would be nice to see a bit more of too.
Yeah, I also think that's a difficult one to balance, at least in a way that isn't annoying.
True.
It's frustrating having abilities on your cards not trigger until the next upkeep or something. That's the argument against, not that Phyrexian Arena isn't still a decent card, but like that's the argument against Phyrexian Arena. Spending 3 mana and I don't get to draw my first card till next turn and my second card till the turn after. So it takes 4 turns until you've gotten the same value out of a Phyrexian Arena as you'd get from a Night's Whisper. And you're spending 1 more mana on that effect. Mm-hmm. So I understand the logic there and why that's frustrating. On the other hand, I also kind of hate something like Ukima Stalking Shadow, where when Ukima leaves the battlefield, it deals X damage to target player and you gain X life. So you can't exile it, you can't kill it, you can't it's going to generate the value regardless. Mm-hmm. Same thing with I think one of the things that makes Brago pretty fair is you have to deal combat damage with Brago. So if you
all of his stuff targets.
Yeah. So there's ways to stop that. I think Brago is very powerful, but when I play against that deck for Max, I feel like, okay, I have ways to, if things break right, I have responses to that. When I play against an Akima deck, I feel like, man, if I don't have a Song of the Dryads or something in my hand, that's just going to consistently deal a ton of damage and gain a ton of life. And it's very difficult to prevent that thing from happening short of a stifle. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the balance is, because if it's easy to make a card too ineffective, but it's easy to make it too effective and frustrating too. So
right,
that's tricky, but I do think they've by and large gotten much better at that, making things trigger, particularly if it's an expensive effect where you really would feel bad if you had to wait a full turn for it. They make it trigger when this comes into play or at the beginning of each upkeep, or just make it trigger at the end of turn too. Sometimes I think they've gotten better at it without making it routinely be an Okima situation where you feel like it's inevitable. Yeah, that's really what I have for things I think they're pretty much on the right path these days, and I'm very happy with how the precons look.
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, I am very much looking forward to buying all of the Warhammer 40k ones, just because I'm definitely a lore person, and the lore in that 40k universe. I don't play the game, but the lore behind those decks is just spot on from what I can see, and they look like they play really well together. They look very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not I've played Warhammer I think once ever with the miniatures years ago, so I'm not really well versed on the game at all. Other than I think the stuff looks cool, and I at this point I've just become accustomed to the Universes Beyond stuff, and it doesn't bother me at all. So more chances for cool commander cards that might work in my deck is great as far as I'm concerned. Max, any final thoughts here from you?
No, I like where we're going. Again, these precons aren't for everybody, and choose what you want to buy, I guess, is the biggest thing for me still is. But I think they've gotten better, and I too am looking forward to the Warhammer stuff and what else we'll get through the Dominaria Phyrexia storyline.
Excellent.
I hope we get an Atraxa Precon again.
Ooh, yes. I could see that again for sure. Yeah, I hadn't even thought of that. That's a good call. Atraxa. Max, you're a monster.
I know.
All right. Kyle, thanks a lot for supporting the show, and thanks for coming on. We do appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'll see you next week.
I will try not to target you first. We just recorded a show that hasn't aired before you heard this. No, but we recorded one because we're recording a couple shows back to back right now. And I actually talked about you on the show because we just recorded one talking about
the why I target you episode.
Yeah. and I mentioned because that was kind of the impetus for it. I'm like, I actually just played it this week, and I played a couple games against Kyle, and I wound up hitting him a couple times early. And here's my rationale for why I hit Kyle a couple times.
So your apology is what's coming in the episode, is what I'm hearing.
So right. So listen to that show, and you can hear my explanation for why I killed you.
And he'll do it all over again on Tuesday night.
I believe it. I would expect nothing less.
All right. Thank you guys very much. Kyle, why don't you let anyone know if you're on Twitter or anything where they can reach you and say hi if they want to.
Just stop in at the local LGS.
There we go.
I'm kind of like the local friendly player that the store owners just throw me in pods of new people because I don't pistol whip everyone around. So I like to see people pop up and do things.
Thanks for coming on, and thanks for supporting the show. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
You can find me on the Twitter birds at Dana Roach. You can find Max at CMDRCentral_Max. And you can find Chris at WiseSquishy1. Our show is edited by Rafael Garcia, and you can find them on Twitter at Ursa Bearwalker. And our podcast theme is Retro Future Dirty by Kevin McCall, licensed via Creative Commons. Until next week, I'm Dana.
I'm Max.
And I'm Kyle.